How accurate are the Suebi in Rome Total War 2? This game is quite old now. I don't know exactly when it was released, but a while ago. And I'm not sure if people still play it. I think people definitely still play it, but I don't think it's one of the top played even Total War games these days. So I don't know how much people are going to be interested in this. Probably not that much, but I thought it would be a fun format to try for a video. Maybe a little bit of background about myself and why I might be qualified to talk about how historically accurate the Suebi are in this particular game. I've got a degree in cultural studies and I'm currently writing my master's thesis to attain a degree in European history. And throughout my studies, I've focused on the early history and prehistory of Central Europe. In particular, I focused on the study of the Germanic peoples. So I thought it would be a fun idea to check out the Suebi here in Rome 2 Total War. I think that's what it was called. And see how good of a job Creative Assembly have done with it. Now we're going to keep in mind that this is a game first and foremost, and it's supposed to be fun. So don't take this too seriously. I'll also try and take this into consideration when we're potentially discussing gameplay mechanics and stuff like that. That factors in trying to do something historically accurate, but also fun as a video game. Let's get right into it. I'm going to start with the faction overview we've got here on screen right now. Go through everything we see on here and discuss whether that's historically accurate or not. Then go into the actual campaign and see what we can find there and discuss things there. Things like the settlements, what kind of structures and buildings you can build. I also want to have a look at the different units you can recruit and if there is some basis for those in the historical records and in the archaeological findings. That is what most of this is going to be based on. And yeah, let's get right into it. So as you can see, the Suebi are considered a Germanic people here, which is correct. Probably. Kind of depends a little bit on your definition of Germanic. The jury is still out on where the term actually comes from and what it referred to originally. There is some evidence that suggests that the term Germani was first used by a Greek historian and polymath really called Posidonius, and referred to only a group of people situated at the Lower Rhine, this region here on the map, and that the term from there spread to all tribes across the Rhine. So they generalized, they took some people who came from across the Rhine into what is northeastern Gaul, right here, and then applied that term to people east of the River Rhine, even though some of them may not have been Germani in the same sense that those people who came across the Rhine and were now on the left bank of the Rhine. So whether that is accurate for all of these people in the earliest time, in like the 1st century BC, is not entirely clear. And the Suebi are actually one of the people who may have been something different. So when you think of Germans, ancient Germans that is nowadays, we often base that on an understanding of the language that they speak, or that they spoke rather, which we classify as Germanic, which is ancestral to modern Germanic languages like German, but also English and the Scandinavian languages and Dutch, a few others as well. And it is very likely that the Suebi spoke such a language, but interestingly, it may be that those Germans, the first Germans that were situated here at the Lower Rhine, may not have spoken a Germanic language, but potentially a Celtic language or something in between Celtic and Germanic. Maybe something that was more closely related to the Italic languages or Venetic, which was a language very closely related to Italic, according to some linguists, a part of the Italic language family, but with a few distinctive features that made it more similar to Celtic and Germanic than other Italic languages, if it is an Italic language. But that just as a sort of background to the term Germanic and Germani as it was used in classical antiquity by classical authors and how that developed. In a certain sense, the Suebi were definitely seen as a Germanic people, since at the very least the times of Julius Caesar, but they may not have been Germanic in the sense of how this term was originally used. but at the latest since Caesar, they were seen as Germanic, and so was everybody else who lived across the Rhine, with a few minor exceptions. First point of contention, were the Suebi Germanic tribes a Germanic tribe? Probably yes, although you could make the point that at the time this starts in 272 BC, the term was not around yet, and when we first have mention of Germanic peoples at the time of Posidonius, they may not have been considered Germanic yet, and what Germanic meant at that time may have been something different, as it has then come to mean since Caesar, and how the term Germanic is understood today. Right. Let's move on to the overview of the Germanic tribes. The Germanic tribes are fearless warriors. That is attested in the sources, but that's what they said about basically every barbarian people, especially northern barbarians. They said the same thing about the Gauls, about other Celtic peoples as well. So that is just general northern stereotyping at the hands of the classical authors. Entirely at home in their dark and forbidding forests. Now, there definitely were more forests in ancient Germania than there are today, but contrary to popular belief, it wasn't that the whole place was just covered in forests. The Germani, or the Germanic tribes, did primarily live off of agriculture, which meant they had to cut down a lot of forest area to use as farmland. So forest density wasn't quite as high as is often imagined and as it was described by ancient authors. So they were definitely dark and forbidding forests, but they didn't cover the whole area, the whole of Germania, as is sometimes assumed. Again, based on the accounts of ancient authors. They often took stereotypes called topoi in the scientific literature and just applied them to, because it was expected. They had this picture there in their minds of how the northern world looked and wanted to convey that to their audience, because they weren't writing for themselves, they were writing books for an audience. Often they had certain goals and principles in mind, and they tried to be, in certain areas at least, objective, but they were also very much products of their own literary conventions. And speaking of dark and forbidding forests, that is one of those conventions that they potentially felt they had to fulfill. So that is why in many classical sources, when it comes to ancient Germania in particular, but Northern Europe in general, we often hear about dark and forbidding forests. So that is why it's there. Worshipping dark, forbidding gods. Now, we actually don't know a whole lot about Germanic mythology at that time, certainly not at 272 BC. The earliest account of Germanic religion we have is by Caesar in his commentaries, referring to a time in the mid-1st century BC, where he says that the Germanic tribes only worshipped the sun, the moon, and fire. Now, that is probably incorrect. Again, probably just something that Caesar said to make the ancient Germans seem and appear more savage. They don't even have proper gods. They just worship the sun, the moon, and fire, like some savages. That's basically what he wanted to get across. What we do know of the Germanic mythology, religion, and pantheon is that it was probably very similar to other Indo-European peoples, such as the Romans themselves and the Celts, the Greeks, which is why the author Tacitus likened many of the Germanic gods to Roman gods. So dark forbidding gods is not necessarily correct. They were very similar gods to the ones the Romans worshipped as well. And we do know from later sources, from the Viking Age and from the early Middle Ages, and from the continent as well, that gods like Wodan slash Odin and Thor slash Donar were worshipped by these people, these groups of peoples, and that they were quite similar in the way they worshipped and the gods themselves to other Indo-European peoples. Alright, their name in Latin is a Gallic borrowing, ger and mani, meaning near men or neighbors. That is one interpretation of the name and the origin of the name, and it might well be true. There are other possibilities as to what it might mean. Ger in Proto-Germanic could mean spear as well, so it could have something to do with that. But yeah, basically the term, we're not entirely sure where the term comes from. Might have been used by the Gauls in northeastern Gaul, the Belgae, as Caesar referred to them, to describe the newcomers that had come across the Rhine, and that Caesar knows the Germani, Cisrenani, the Germans on this side of the Rhine. And as I said before, that term was then taken and applied to a variety of people that lived across the Rhine. But what exactly that term means and where it comes from, we don't know definitively. They're not given to acting in a neighborly fashion. They will take from the weak and value their independence above all. Well, I don't know, that's also just stereotyping. But they certainly did fight their neighbors, other Germanic tribes, as well as other tribes that spoke other languages and had different cultures. But they also traded with them. They also intermarried. They also had diplomatic contacts with them. They entered into alliances with them. War was one form of contact, or raiding was one form of contact, but there were many, many others as well. And I don't think they were more warlike than other people of their time. I mean, look at the Romans themselves, or the Greeks with Alexander, who conquered large parts of the ancient world through war. So that was just a reality of the time back then. And they valued their independence above all. That is probably a reference to the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, which was interpreted, especially in the 19th century, by German historians as a fight for the freedom of the Germanic peoples. But it probably wasn't that. There was no sense of a pan-Germanic identity. And I think freedom and independence is something that's important to probably every individual and every people. I don't think the ancient Germans were particularly more freedom-loving or independent than other people of their time. We've got here some bonuses that the factions get. We've got Warrior Society, +2 public order for every war against a neighboring faction. That is pretty nonsensical, I think. You could argue that the Germanic society was a warrior society, but as I've just explained, you could argue that about neighboring societies at that time for sure as well, not just the ancient Germans. Roman society certainly at the beginning was also warrior society, and war remained to be very important in the Roman Empire, or the military in general, for a very long time, arguably forever. So yeah, I mean, this is just a gameplay mechanic that they put in there to have a gameplay mechanic. Heroes of the Night can always choose to fight night battles. I mean, I feel like everybody should be able to do that in a Total War game. Unless, well, there might be, you should maybe incorporate that with some other mechanic that you have to like lay an ambush and then you can choose night battles or something like that. But yeah, I guess this is just another fun gameplay mechanic. It hasn't much to do with historical accuracy or anything like that. So yeah, that is just that. Okay, that is the preliminary out of the way, I guess. Let's move on to the Suebi themselves. What does the game tell us about this? First, the start here, 272 BC. I've mentioned this a few times. In 272 BC, we haven't had any reports of the Suebi or any Germanic people yet. It is likely that they were already around based on the archaeological evidence, but strictly speaking, we don't know for sure. But yeah, the game starts in that year, and I think it's fair enough to include them. The first mentions of Germanic peoples we have over 160 years later, which might not sound that long in the grand scheme of things, but it is a very long time. If you think about what the world was like 160 years ago, it becomes much more clear and apparent how big of a gap that actually is. But yeah, I'd rather have them in the game than not. So yeah, I'm happy with that. And as I said, the Suebi probably in some form might have been around, or their ancestors might have been around at that point already. Again, based on the archaeological evidence, so I'm happy for them to be included at that time period. What do we have here? The faction description, I guess. Pagan gods, pagan ways, a hunger for battle, and a need for loot and slaves could drive the Suebi from the forests. Again, forests weren't as widespread as they often assumed to have been, but I've already covered that. Pagan gods, pagan ways. Everybody was pagan, so I don't know why that's pointed out. Hunger for battle. Again, every society back then was basically warlike, so nothing special. Need for loot and slaves. Need for loot and slaves. Getting loot and getting slaves was one form of accumulating wealth, but again, that was true for every society back then. And with opportunity before them, what will stand in the way of determined warriors intent on glory and greatness? Well, I guess nothing. Yeah, not much to say about that I haven't already covered. We've got two other bonuses here, in particular to the Suebi. I wonder if they originally planned to have more than one Germanic tribe in the game. Would have been really cool to see. But yeah, we ended up with only the Suebi, and I'm glad that they included them out of all of the Germanic peoples, because they feature very heavily from Caesar onwards and are often described as a different group from the other Germanic peoples. Again, giving credit to the idea that they were different originally as well, the Germani in the west here. Bonuses. Tribal Conquerors, plus 20% morale for all units during battles against barbarian tribes. Okay. Again, those are just gameplay mechanics. They have nothing to do with any historical events or descriptions, at least not much. Maybe one last thing before we actually jump into the campaign and look at the settlements and how the Suebi actually play. We actually don't exactly know what the Suebi were. So our first mention of the Suebi comes from Julius Caesar under a certain Arivist who probably was Suebian. Some Suebi went into Gaul and established a realm there. I don't know if you can call it a kingdom. Arivist was referred to as a king by the Romans and by Julius Caesar, but don't actually know what that meant. The term rex is what was used, and is usually described as king, but it can't be interpreted the same way as we would interpret the word king today, which is often in like an absolutist understanding or interpretation of the word. So he probably wasn't something like that. The way the term rex was used by the Romans was also usually in reference to their own kings back when Rome was ruled by kings, which was seen as tyrannical, so generally kind of a bad thing. So we don't know if that is accurate to describe Germanic leaders that were referred to as rex. We don't even know if they called themselves that. What is clear is that he was a leader of a large group of Germanic warriors that had taken possession of a part of Gaul, I think 14 years prior to the arrival of Julius Caesar in Gaul, and Caesar eventually defeated them and drove them back across the Rhine. And it's not entirely clear in Caesar's account where the Suebi are located, but he makes some suggestions. He indicates that they were located originally behind other Germanic peoples, which puts them sort of in the east of what came to refer to as Germania, which is sort of where they are located here on the map. And later authors such as Pliny and Tacitus, most importantly, located them in this area here as well. But back to the point, Pliny and Tacitus said that the Suebi were not a singular tribe, but a collection of tribes that differed in language and custom from the other Germanic peoples, particularly to the west. This has been interpreted as a sort of tribal confederation, or potentially a religious cult that multiple different tribes belong to, but we don't really know what it actually referred to. What is very interesting is that the territory in which Suebi are usually located can be identified with either the Jastorf culture in the Iron Age or the Alp Germanic culture in the early Imperial period. So there seems to be some connection between this archaeological material culture, the Alp Germanic culture developed from the Jastorf culture, probably should have mentioned that, and the Suebi. So what might be the case is that the Suebi were a people different from other Germanic groups in terms of a material culture and probably culture in general, and that might have been what the Suebi were. They were just a culture amongst other cultures of Central Europe at the time, for example, the Celts and the original Germans in that sense of Posidonius that I mentioned earlier. And that is my interpretation, at least, that they were a culture that came to influence other cultures around them, most importantly those Germani in Western Germania and at the Lower Rhine and the Middle Rhine as well, which then came to speak their language and what we now refer to as Germanic. But that is more or less just a theory that many others have voiced in the past, that can't be proved definitively, as is the case with so many things so far back in time. But yeah, we don't actually know what the Suebi were. I believe they were a culture. They may have been some kind of loose political confederation as well, and they may have had similar beliefs and religious ceremonies and practices as well. So the answer might be they were a bit of everything. But I think this about covers it with this faction screen. Let's just jump into the campaign and see what we deal with here and what we can talk about.
The Celts think themselves superior, but their decadence makes them weak. The Boii are nearby. Put them out of their misery and seize their lands for the tribe. Move westward, and you will get the chance to kill Gauls, although other German tribes stand between you. War comes naturally to your people, and the tribes are ever at one another's throats. But waging war will make your rivals more open to negotiation. However, your ultimate goal should be confederation. The joining of tribes to make a single, stronger one. Under Suebi leadership, the people of Germania will rise up and crush their enemies.
Alright, welcome to the campaign map. So, objective issued. I don't know if there's anything here. No, that is nothing really to talk about. What we can talk about, though, is this little intro that we've just been given by this guy here. I'm not going to discuss if the way he looks is historically accurate yet. I might get into that when we look at the units in particular. We are the Suebi. The Celts think themselves superior. Now, the Celts was probably not a term used by the Suebi or other Germanic peoples. There's some indication that they were referred to as Welsh, which is why the Welsh are called Welsh in English, because the English are a Germanic-speaking people. And when they found the Welsh in Britain, they were like, oh, those are the same guys, similar guys as to the ones we know from the continent. Also spoke a Celtic language, so we're going to call them the same. In Switzerland, the Italian-speaking population is still referred to as Welsh as well. So the Germanic peoples evidently thought that Italic and Celtic languages were very similar and referred to them by the same name. Now, this guy says they think themselves superior. First of all, the Celts were not a unified people, same as the Germans. I think they can be seen as a culture similar to the Suebi, but not a unified people. And it is likely that just like the Romans and the Greeks in particular, who coined the term Celt and recognized them as a culture, a group of people that belongs together in a sense, it is likely that the Germanic peoples saw it the same way. Often cultures like this, like the Suebi or the Celts, are not recognized as such by the people who belong to that culture, because it takes an outsider's perspective to see these similarities that justify grouping them together as a culture. Whereas for individual groups inside of a culture, ethnic identity is more important. Ethnic identity being which group you identify with based on sometimes or often ancestry and an arbitrary amount of shared cultural customs, but very localized ones. And then you don't see how much you actually share with your immediate neighbors. That is the difference between a cultural identity and an ethnic identity. Now, this guy is saying that the Celts think themselves superior. This, again, Celts are one of the things, so they can't think of themselves as such. But from a material culture perspective, the culture that is most prominently associated with the ancient Celts, especially in this area here, would have been the Latin culture. And that culture indeed was much more developed than the culture of the Suebi, who would have been associated with the Yastov culture. The Suebi, or the Yastov culture at that time, they didn't have any centralized towns. They didn't have much social stratification at that point yet. They didn't have much of a specialized economy. They didn't produce much in general. And what they produced was generally of lower quality than what the people who were referred to by ancient authors as Celts produced to the south. So it is true that in a material sense, the people to the south, the Celts, were definitely superior. But a decadence makes them weak. That is also, again, a literary topoi, so something that ancient authors said about the Celts, or about barbarian peoples in general. They thought of them as generally quite hardy people, harsh people, savage people. They thought that contact with the civilized world, with the Romans and the Greeks, make them weaker. I think that is something that this alludes to. Interestingly, the Romans themselves believed that contact with the Greeks, who they regarded as culturally superior to themselves, made themselves weaker. And there's quite a few voices, ancient authors, who voiced concerns about the growing Greek influence, cultural influence on Roman culture at the time of the Roman Republic, which is very interesting. Right, the Boii are nearby. They are indeed. So the Boii were a Celtic people who are located directly to the south of the Suebi here, and that might be accurate, broadly speaking, as well. We have some indication, some authors, I think Strabo and Tacitus, potentially Pliny as well, who located them in this area, which roughly responds to modern Bohemia or Czechia, that the Boii were originally located here. So this is actually pretty good. Put them out of their misery and seize the lands for the tribe. Move westward and you will get the chance to kill Gauls. So Gauls were certainly positioned westwards, and as this guy says, German tribes stand between you. So Gauls would have been across the Rhine. At this time, you could argue that the south here, not only where the Boii are, but also here in the southwest of modern Germany or Germania, we probably would have had people that ancient authors would have referred to as Gauls, at least Celts. By the way, the term Gauls, Celts, and also Galatians was used interchangeably a lot of the time by ancient authors. It's only through modern scholarship that the term Celt came to be a general term for Celtic-speaking populations, and Gauls were only referring to people of Gaul, and Galatians mostly to people in what came to be known as Galatia in Anatolia. The south of Germania was probably Gaulish/Celtish, as is the case over here with the Boii, but I don't think this is actually Celtic in the game at the moment. I think the Marcomanni are really located there in the game, but we might have to actually play a little bit to uncover some of the map here, so I can have a proper look at everything. As he mentions, there's other Germanic tribes in between us and the Gauls, which is also correct. We can see at least a Cherusci here to the west of the Suebi, and they were in fact located in this area 200, almost 300 years later from the time we're playing it right now, which again is in 272 BC. Obviously, the Cherusci are very famous for being the chief tribe that fought against the Romans in the Battle of Teutoburg Forest under Arminius. Now again, we have no idea if the Cherusci already existed at this time, as the earliest evidence of their existence is 300 years later. So yeah, we have no idea if they existed at that time, but again, it's a game and they were working with what they had. There were also a lot of other tribes around this area, but obviously they only have so many different provinces, and a province can't be occupied by multiple tribes, so it's fine that they chose one tribe, and they chose possibly the most prominent and one of the more prominent ones in this area. Could make an argument that maybe the Chatti were also important, but they would have been maybe a little further south, actually, maybe here. That was maybe too far south, somewhere in this area potentially, but yeah, that's fine. War comes naturally to your people, again, came to naturally to everybody back then, and the tribes are ever at one another's throat. Yeah, there was a lot of war, but again, there was also peace and trade and diplomatic contact and confederations and alliances, and yeah, war wasn't certainly the only way of making contact with your neighbors. Waging war will make your rivals more open to negotiation. War can definitely be a diplomatic tool, I guess. However, your ultimate goal should be confederation. Now that is interesting in the case of the Suebi, because as I said, there is one possibility that the Suebi themselves were a confederation of tribes. And as I mentioned, Tacitus and Pliny mentioned, and I think Strabo as well. I'm not sure about Strabo, but Tacitus and Pliny for sure mentioned that the Suebi consisted of a multitude of tribes, which would have been located in this area here, but as well up here, up the river Elbe, all the way to here, possibly even the south of the Jutland Peninsula here, around the area of modern Hamburg. And later on, we will find Suebi in this area here as well, in Bohemia, and also in the southwest of modern Germany. The joining of tribes to make a single stronger one. Under Suebi leadership, the people of Germania will rise up and crush their enemies. So yeah, they're saying the people of Germania should unite, but there was no sense of shared identity among the Germanic people. Maybe amongst the different Suebian people and tribes, but definitely not among the whole of the populations or the groups that ancient authors refer to as Germanic. Okay, now we are starting here. I already spoke about the location. This is our settlement, Lupfördum. I have no idea what this is based on. As I have mentioned before, we have no mention of towns and no archaeological evidence of towns at this time in Germania. Caesar actually does refer to Oppida, which is a Latin term for town in regards to the Suebi, but we have no archaeological evidence of that, so it might be that the Suebi at the time of Caesar came across to western Germania, where there were towns, and occupied them, and that is what Caesar was referring to, but in the actual area that the Suebi originally occupied, we don't have any evidence of towns, so that being a town doesn't make any sense from a historical...
As the main administrative center
Shut
in the
up, I'm
region,
monologuing.
the settlement contains
Doesn't make any sense from a historical perspective, but again, it's a gameplay mechanic. Every province has to have a town, so it's fine. They did have settlements, but they were smaller. They were more on the scale of villages rather than towns. Also, the name, no idea where that is from. Interestingly, it's called Lupfurdum. I don't know if this sound, the PF sound, existed in Proto-Germanic. I'd have to ask a linguist. I'm not a linguist. But generally in Proto-Germanic, I would have expected to have a P sound, PP, another PF sound, because that is a development of the High German dialects in the early Middle Ages. But again, I've never read this name anywhere before. I think they just made something up. That's fine. Again, they need a town, they need to give it a name, so might as well give it a name. I'm not a linguist, I don't know if this is Proto-Germanic. Yeah, I really don't know. The ending dum is, I think, Celtic, so this might be a Celtic name, but I'd have to confirm that with a linguist. Maybe somebody in the comments can tell us if this is a Celtic name or what the hell is going on here. Right. Can I actually look into the town? Can you stop, please? I think in Rome 2, in Rome 1, you could actually look into the towns. I don't know if you can do that here. It doesn't look like you can. Okay. Well, I can look at this overview of the town here, I guess. And as I said, they wouldn't have that big towns. I mean, the overview here doesn't look like a big town. It's just a bunch of houses. How many are there? I don't know. A dozen? So that might actually be sort of accurate, but we don't have any indication of fortifications in villages at that time in this area. So that would be historically inaccurate. The Celtic peoples, the people of the Latin culture further to the south, like the Boii, would have had that, and as you can see, they do have that here. Don't know if there's any difference in the different cultures and the way their settlements look, but the Germanic peoples wouldn't have had that. Also, even if they did have fortifications, usage of stone like that would have not been the case, I don't think. It's hard to see how much stone there is. I don't know. It might be what is referred to as a Pfostenschlitzmauer in the scientific literature, which the Celts further to the south would have used, but it's difficult to judge from this perspective. In terms of the houses, are those houses those round ones here? Because if so, I don't think we've got any evidence of round houses for this area. Round houses were very typical of the culture of Britain at the time in the Iron Age, but I don't think they were on the continent. What is more typical are houses like this, long houses that were typically divided into a living area and an area where your animals were, because your animals were your biggest wealth, and they also kept the house warm. Okay, what we could do is go through the buildings here. So, we've got fortified settlement here. As I said, such a thing didn't exist. Basically, where we would have stopped is this. That settlement. A normal settlement, no fortifications, just a few houses, pretty small. That would have been a Germanic settlement. This is something that we find amongst the Celts. And 100, it seems like this is differentiated from the previous building by stout walls, keep out many unwanted visitors. So I assume that's just a bigger settlement with bigger walls, tribal oppidum. Now here we have the term oppidum that I've already mentioned. Again, that is something that would have existed amongst Celtic peoples, not amongst the Suebi. It would have existed on amongst the Germani of Western Germania, but not amongst the Suebi at that time. Okay, yeah, there's different kinds of oppida, that's the plural of oppidum, that you can build. But again, they're not. None of them would be historically accurate for the Suebi at this time. Artisans' lodging. Now here we have different kind of workshops. As I said, there's not much evidence among the Suebi for specialization like this. There might have been, there must have been some smiths, especially the closer we get to the Imperial period. Everything became more important, weapon became more important, but at this time, there might have been some specialization, but not much. There's barely any evidence of that for that time. So yeah, I don't think this is overly accurate. Also, there's no evidence at all of coins among the Suebi. That would have not existed. Horn maker, trumpet maker, carnix maker. Okay, well, horns were used, trumpets, I don't think so, and carnix were Celtic, so they were not used amongst the Suebi as well. Bronze furnace, I don't know why we'd have bronze weapons in the Iron Age still. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the main material that weapons were made out of at this point was definitely iron. So yeah, I don't know why this is bronze. So I don't think that is historically accurate either. Cool. We've got one other tree here. A holy tree. So we do have accounts of trees being considered holy in Germanic culture in the sources, and it is something that is probably true because we have loads of accounts of that, not only from antiquity, but also from the early Middle Ages all the way up until the Viking Age. So trees were probably revered. At least some trees were, and seen as holy, and might have been involved in some sacrifices and rituals as well. So I would say that is historically accurate. But they also had temples. Groves did exist. Shrines also did exist, as well as a sanctuary. What would you call? I mean, a sanctuary is quite generic, I would say. But it's a sanctuary. How would you define that? That could be any of these things. Kind of missing temple. If these can be interpreted as temples, then yeah, there is evidence that some buildings were used as temples by the Suebi. So I would say there's no big issue with this. All these gods, they probably revered in some way or another, based on later evidence and based on comparisons to other Indo-European cultures. So not much of an issue with this here at all. Now we got a government overview, and this is interesting. Obviously, this is arranged as a parliament in some countries is, and it is likely from the evidence that we have that there was some kind of council or senate that made decisions, and that there was no absolute leader in the sense of a king or something like that. So that there is something like this in the game. It is likely that that is how decisions were made for the group, for the tribe. That is nice to see here. I don't know if there would have been different factions like this. They would have been organized like parties in the modern sense, but they might have done. But yeah, that is a good guess. We also, based on the archaeological evidence, as I said, don't have much evidence for stratification. So more of a egalitarian, almost democratic way of doing things might have been more close to reality than assuming there was a king or nobles. There probably were some nobles at some point, but I actually don't know if this early we have evidence for that actually. That's maybe something that's also interesting to point out. Okay, so now, lastly, I think that's going to be the last thing we do on the campaign map here, is examine the neighbors of the Suebi and if they're historically accurate or not. Again, we are in the year 270 BC, so we've moved on 2 years, but still, we have no detailed knowledge of this landscape, of this region of Europe at all at this time period, so we can only infer where groups might have lived from later accounts. We already spoke about the Boyai and Kuruski, and although again for this time period we don't know for sure where they were, I think for the Boyai we are more certain than for the Kuruski. We just uncovered the Marcomanni here. Marcomanni are another Germanic people. Their name means border people, which probably comes from the fact that they were situated close to non-Germanic speaking peoples as well as close to non-Suebian peoples, because they, at least later on, Pliny and Tacitus, towards the end of the 1st century AD, classified them as Suebian. And they were a very powerful Suebian people. They fought with Ariovistus in Gaul against Caesar. Caesar didn't specify that they were Suebi though, but they fought with Suebi. So they might have been Suebi then already, who knows. But that they were considered Suebi, I think already around the time of the birth of Christ, when under the leader Marbod they established an empire actually here in Bohemia, where the Boii are. Another interesting fact, maybe on a side note, is that Bohemia actually comes from the Boii, and it means home of the Boii originally. Anyway, the Marcomanni in Rome too are located here in what is southwestern Germania, and they might have been there actually around this exact area, not as far south that this goes to like the Alps and Lake Constance, but somewhere along the river Main, which would be flowing along here somewhere. It is not on the map, I don't think. They might have been somewhere around here originally, but by the time we have our earliest sources, they were located here already where the Boii were originally. So them being placed here is, according to the sources, the earliest sources that we have, probably accurate. Again, we don't know if they were there in 270 BC because we don't have sources going back that far, but it's the best guess we can make based on the sources that we have. So that is fine by me. We got the Lugii over here. Now they were a tribe that wasn't mentioned too often, I don't think, in the sources, but was generally located in the eastern parts of Germania, so the general location seems to be okay. I think it is speculated that they were related to the Vandals. I think Pliny grouped them in the same group as the Vandals. I think he might have even termed the whole group of peoples in eastern Germania the Vandilii. But again, this is a source from the end of the 1st century AD, so as with the previous times, we don't know if they were there at this time, but it's the best they could do. Similar here with the Gutones, who were also mentioned by Tacitus and Pliny. Also in this area, roughly, again, as I said, or I mentioned earlier with the Cherusci, there are a lot more tribes than the Marcomanni, the Lugii, and the Gutones, but those were some of the more prominent ones, which is why I think Creative Assembly decided to place them there. And obviously, if they wanted to have an accurate map of Germania, they would have to had a lot smaller provinces to place all of the tribes that we know of there. Same here with the Rugii, they were roughly in that area. I think they might have been a little further east, actually. No, actually, I think they're correct where they're placed. Forget what I said. I think they actually were roughly located in this area here. So that's fine. And lastly, we have the Cimbri all the way up here. And according to our sources, they were believed to have come from Jutland. And they're actually the earliest Germanic people that we know of. At least most modern scholars believe that they were Germanic. Famously, they went south on campaign, or on potentially something like a migration, at least a part of those tribes. Went south through most of Europe, most of Western Europe, that is, through Germania. It's not entirely clear which route they took, because we know that they went into the area of the Helvetii, which are thought to actually have lived somewhere along here as well, maybe south of where the Marcomanni are right now. Caesar also tells us that they tried to cross into Belgium and were actually repelled by the native inhabitants of Belgium, the ancient Belgae. Most sources agree that they were situated in Jutland. Again, these sources, although they're earlier than for the other populations, they date from around 100 BC. We still don't know if they were there at that time period. So again, but they'd done the best they could with the sources they had. So overall, I think I'm pretty happy with the different groups we have here on the map. And yeah, I think this is going to be it for the map here. And the last thing I want to do is have a look at the different units that we have in the game. Okay, we could go through all of the units here and determine whether they're historically accurate or not. Or we could go actually look at them. Maybe we'll rule out the most unlikely to be historically accurate, and the ones that are somewhat plausible we'll take into our army and then take a look at on the actual battle map. What we can rule out immediately is artillery. There was no artillery, there was no such thing as a German giant ballista, as cool as that sounds. Fortunately, I'll have to disappoint you. No German Scorpion, no Onager, no heavy Onager, nothing like that, unfortunately. I guess we'll just keep moving up. Missile cavalry, Germanic scout riders. Again, it's been a while since I played the game. I think these are cavalry that have javelins, and that is something that certainly could have existed. And we do have reports of Germanic cavalry being desirable as well. Caesar actually used them in as mercenaries in his campaign in Gaul. So we're gonna take a closer look at those. We also have melee cavalry, noble riders existed as well. Riders of the Hunt. Now I don't know what that is. I want to take a look at those actually. Horse runners. Oh, that is very interesting. So there are reports again from Caesar that when he faced the Germans and the Suebi in Gaul, that the Suebi fought with mixed infantry and cavalry units. So there were infantrymen, young guys, young men who would run along cavalry to support them in melee combat. And this is what this might be inspired by, but it looks like this is not a mixed unit. I think this is just infantry. Would have been cool if they could have done that more accurately. But let's have a look at them. Cimbri bowwomen. Now, I don't think there's mention of women fighting with the Cimbri. I don't know where that comes from. Maybe it's just, you know, creative license. Women are thought to have played an important role in Germanic society, at least according to the sources that we have, but never in a combat role, at least not as far as I can recall, and have recently read through all of the sources again for my thesis, and I don't think there's any mention of Cimbri bowwomen. Could be wrong though, I might double check that, but I'm 99% sure that's not a thing. Germanic youths, could look at those as well. Longbow hunters. I mean, these are all, I think, pretty unproblematic. There were people who, there were archers, there were people who threw javelins, there were slingers. Now, were they organized in units like this? I don't know. That is probably, yeah, unlikely. It's more likely that they fought in mixed units, that they fought in mixed bands, and not like you do in Rome Total War. But there were certainly slingers, archers, and javelin men in Germanic troops. But Wodinus spears here, I want to take a look at those. Night hunters, I don't know what those are. Spear women, again, we don't have any mention of those, so I don't think we'll have to have a look at those. Spear wall, spear brothers, spear levy, I think those are all relatively unproblematic because they all just look like guys with spears, and from the archaeological evidence that we have, the spears and shields were the most important weapons, melee weapons, in Germanic society, amongst the Suebi as well, and probably across Northern Europe at that time. Let's have a look at the swordmasters. Berserkers. Now, berserkers as a term we know from Norse myth, but we're not really, I don't think we've got much evidence of that in the sources. I'd have to double check that though. Let's have a look at the Wolf Warriors 2, Hex Bearers, whatever they are, Round Shield Swordsmen. Now, Round Shields I don't think we have much evidence for either. Bloodsworn. Don't have to have a look at the club levies, I don't think. Maybe let's take those in there. There's a general. Maybe let's take these and then we can... Oh, funds left. Can I have more funds? Funds large. Ultra, here we go. Okay, let's just do that and... What do the boy I have? Do they have... Oh, they've got stuff there automatically. Okay, wow. Right. They've got a way better army than me. They spend way more funds. They're going to flatten us. Anyway, let's jump into the battle and see if we can examine our troops a little more closely. Right. Here we are on the battle map. Let's just examine our troops from left to right, I guess. Up close. Can I? Yes, I can. So up here we've got our Germanic scout riders, and I think these are mostly accurate. There's not anything that jumps out at me that would be inaccurate. They got their typical weapons. They've got spears and shields, which would have been, as I said, the most typical. That shape of shield is something that was very common that we see in depictions of Germanic warriors in Roman reliefs and stuff like that. So that shape seems to have been very common. I mean, there's nothing too special about these. So there's nothing too outrageous about those. I think they're mostly accurate. Would they have fought topless? Would they all have been extremely muscular? Some of them, they were probably on average more muscular than the average person today. But those guys, I think those guys are on steroids, man. It might have not been quite that muscular, but oh well. What can you do? What can you do? Also, I think some of them have a Suebi knot, like this guy here. This is a hairstyle that is attested in the sources, as well as in art, in Roman art. And actually on multiple bog bodies as well that have been found with their hair still intact. So we actually know that people wore their hair like this, which is pretty cool. I think this hairstyle is more inspired by Celtic peoples, especially Britons, which are reported to have styled their hair like this. But I think maybe they just went for generic barbarian hairstyles and gave that to them. And there's some guys with ponytails in there as well. And yeah, sure, probably some people had ponytails, I don't know. I don't, there's no depictions of this, but if they could have other hairstyles, they could have had ponytails as well. Now, these guys, what are they? Those are riders of the hunt. Now, they look almost the same as these guys do. These guys have shoulder spears, though, which I think they use as javelins, which makes sense. These guys have longer spears, and they seem to have different types of spears or lances as well. This type of lance is, I don't think it is attested in the northeast where the Suebi were located, in the Yastav culture and the later Elb Germanic culture. I think they were common, or more common among the people of the Latin culture further to the south and west. But some of them may have been imported. The other lance types, I'm not sure, but they have different lance types, which is in itself a good thing, because you wouldn't have expected troops to have uniform weapons. That was not a thing. People had their weapons and they fought with them, and they were not supplied by factories or anything like that, like the Roman Empire was, especially later on. So their individual equipment would have been individual. Right, what do we have here? What are these guys? This is a spear wall. Okay, these guys I think have the shield screen ability. Form a screen with your shields, guys. And again, they've got the same types of lances. Again, these types, some of them at least, are inspired by the Latin culture. Some of them were imported into the north. We do know that. But I honestly do not know enough about different lance types to tell you which each individual one is inspired by. What's interesting about this unit, though, is that they can form a shield screen. And that's actually something that has been theorized about for the ancient Germanic peoples, that they did fight, at least at this time. Well, when I say this time, yeah, I mean towards the end of the first millennium BC, towards the turn of the millennium there. The size of the shields implies that they fought in a more defensive way, as is often thought. So when we think about barbarians, including the Suebi and Germanic peoples in general, we often think about them just charging headlong into battle and basically throwing their lives away fearlessly and recklessly, and obviously taking loads of their enemies with them as well. But loads, depending on their success, a few at least, I guess. But the size of their shield implies that they fought this defensively in tightly packed formations. So that is why I in particular like this unit here, that they can do that. Right, what do we have next? These guys here is another spear unit. These are just spear brothers. Yeah, these units don't look much different from each other. There really isn't that much variety here, unfortunately. We've got some archers here. Again, we would have had archers. They might have had or carried melee weapons as well. I think those guys do. I think they can fight in melee as well. Can't see right now because they're crouching if they have weapons, but I'm pretty sure if they are melee... Oh yeah, they've got short swords. Okay, now that is actually an issue. So all of these swords that you can see here, I think, are Latin swords. I think all of these swords are typical late Latin swords, Celtic swords, and they were very, very, very rare in Germanic society in general, and amongst Suebi in particular, in the northeast of Germania. A bunch of archers would have never carried Latin longswords. They were prestige weapons reserved for the elite amongst the Germani, and I think even amongst the Celts themselves, they were quite rare prestige goods. So there's no chance in hell that every single one of these would have carried a sword. You could have probably painted the entire army with the amount of swords you have there. Probably multiple armies, so yeah, that is not accurate, unfortunately. What do we have here? These guys are wolf warriors. Now, these guys are armed with clubs, it looks like, big shields, and wolf coats. Now, we have lots of reports from ancient authors that barbarians, not just the Germans, but barbarians in general, wore skins and furs, and they probably did to some degree. There might have been some, like, sects or cults that went into battle with them, but I actually don't think we have any direct attestation of that. That is pure speculation. This guy is really going for it, hey? So yeah, is that historically accurate? I wouldn't say so. But then again, we know of Roman warriors who did that. So there's a possibility that some Germanic warriors had done the same, but I don't think we've got any direct attestation of that, either in the sources or in the archaeological record. Here we've got, I think, our noble warriors. Let me double check. Sword masters. These guys are armed with long swords. Looks like a 10 style as well. Big shields, helmets, and chainmail, which also looks like it's Celtic chainmail. Now, there were probably some noblemen who could afford this kind of equipment, but it would have been very, very few. Probably not even this many in an army of this size, but I don't know how many people these are. There's like 2,000? Is there like a number that tells you? No. I think in other Total War games it might tell you the total number. But yeah, this would have been a very, very rare sight, and none of these pieces of equipment, with the exception of the shield, would have been manufactured locally amongst Suebi or amongst other Germanic people. They would have all been imported from the south at that time from the Celts and later on from the Romans. Iron production, or the production of high quality iron weapons, would have not taken off until the very late 1st century BC amongst people of the Przeworsk, I think that's what it's called, Przeworsk culture, which was located east of where the Suebi were, because they came under very heavy Latin influence. And in other parts of Germania, it took even longer for the production of relatively high quantity iron weapons. I think that didn't really happen on a larger scale until the migration period, if even then. Okay, what else do we have here? We've got guys with javelins. Yeah, that would have been a thing. People throwing javelins, that's normal. Got a few toppers guys here. What are these? Are these round shield swordsmen? Yeah, okay. So I actually am not sure about round shields at this time period. Personally, not all of them have round shields, just a few. I think those square-shaped shields, shields like these ones with all the other units, would have been more common. Some round shields may have been around, but I think later, from like the 1st century AD, shield shapes started to change a bit. Again, problem with the swords here. Oh, okay, this is actually interesting. They've got different swords. Those guys have what is called a sax, which is a short sword that was common amongst Germanic people from, I think, the 1st century AD. I'm not entirely sure for this period. I think they would have been, if they were around already, still pretty rare. But those were actually something that was very typical for Germanic peoples in the migration period, particularly for the Saxons, who are named after this sword, the short sword, the sax. Was very common in Anglo-Saxon England as well, obviously being partly settled by the Saxons. But I'm not entirely sure if this is accurate for this time period already, 3rd century BC. And again, the shields are probably not accurate either. Let's move on to the next guys. Got more guys with javelins here, that's fine. Oh, are these actually the horse runners? Germanic youths. Those were the horse runners over here, okay. Well, unfortunately, yeah, as we feared, they are not fighting with horsemen. It would have been cool and very historically accurate. There's the Cimbri. Oh, there's a hex bearers. The hex strikes fear into enemy warriors' hearts, for it is the harbinger of bloody defeat. Now, I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. But again, these are women. We don't know of women fighting in Germanic armies. I don't think this armor is historically accurate for the period either. It's more Roman, and they've got like 10 swords. So this is probably the historically most inaccurate unit we've got on the field right now. What else do we have here? God, club warriors. don't have much of an issue with those guys. They've got axes and clubs. Now, clubs, unfortunately, are made of wood, so we don't have much archaeological evidence for clubs being used, but it's likely that they were used, especially by poorer people. They couldn't even afford a spear, but it's likely that spears were handed down in the family anyway. So many people would have had a spear, but if they didn't, or if they wanted a different kind of melee weapon, clubs might have been used as well. Axes, on the other hand, I don't think were very commonly used as melee weapons at that time. So that is, I think, inaccurate. Also, I think this axe head here looks like the axe head of a Francisca, which wasn't common until the migration period. I don't know if we have other axe heads here. Got a few other broader ones, but yeah, I don't think those are accurate for the time period either. I'm not entirely sure. And again, I don't think axes were a primary weapon at that time, at least in the archaeological essays, reports, whatever, that I've read. They're never really mentioned up until the migration period as primary weapons. Might be that some people fought with them, but definitely not the majority. Okay, what else do we have here? These guys, they have daggers and the Germanic youths. What does that mean? Oh no, those are the wrong ones. Germanic slingers. Okay, those are slingers with daggers. I'm actually not entirely sure. Again, those are Latin daggers. Okay, maybe the bowmen also had daggers, but it doesn't really change the fact that those are Latin daggers and they would have been very common. And I'm actually not sure. Yeah, no, the Latin daggers are a thing, I think. I have to double check. But yeah, they definitely wouldn't have had the money to afford this many daggers, so also not accurate. We've got more clubmen over here. That's fine. Kind of already spoke about this. What are those guys? They look exactly like the Wolf Warrior. Bloodsworn, okay. Again, problem with the swords here. What are these guys? Spear levy. Okay, I think that is mostly it. What do we have here? There's a wilderness spears. Those just look like generic spearmen again. We really don't have that much unique variety here, unfortunately. And then we have heavy cavalry, which is basically just noblemen on horse. And as I already explained, that is plausible. It could have existed, probably not in such quantities, but yeah, they definitely could have existed. Okay, I think that kind of wraps it up. Let's start a battle and let's get murdered.